Look, today what I thought I might do is to reasonably, against a backdrop of work on innovation districts, is to begin to highlight some of the importance, particularly of the innovation ecosystem that those innovation districts are placed within, and therefore how their key role as an enabler of innovation ecosystems can be to some extent understood and then supported with strategies that account of the strengths in the innovation ecosystem, but also some of the invariable weaknesses or challenges that are in every innovation ecosystem, no matter how large a region or city one is considering. So I've called it rather ambitiously Powering Innovation and Translation Districts and Neighbourhoods, because here in South Australia, we've had some fabulous investments in what I call the capital sunk costs. So remarkable buildings for partners, remarkable locations. And that always takes a considerable time to see those buildings go up, usually generating a lot of building envy around. People think, I'd like to be in that lovely new building. But once the bulldozers have gone, there is now actually the key part, which is activation of those wonderful sunk capital costs to deliver, and to deliver something that could not have happened without that considerable time and effort by many people around many tables to actually plan out those innovation districts. Now, there we go. So reasonably, what I wanted to do first is to put this presentation in an overall context. We are very used to hearing about many fabulous innovation districts that have really been the key leaders, that have actually been the game changers in leading the way, and we've learned an enormous amount from them. But you always have to take stock of your starting position. And I thought I'd start with our national position in the global context. The first thing, I find this graph pretty incredible, actually, because it takes two very big variables and relates them. The first is multi-factor productivity, a sort of measure of a healthy economy and good standards of living, perhaps. And then on the x-axis, and that's a 10-year average of multi-factor productivity. And then here we've got on the x-axis a 10-year average of the R&D expenditure in different countries as a percentage of their gross domestic product. And reasonably, what you can see is a sort of straight line. Not entirely sure how well that fits, but it's certainly a line that catches the eye. You can see some countries are turbocharged, that is, having a much greater return in productivity for the investment to put in R&D. The USA, we'd all assume, has got that economic dynamism and the multinationals, the base that brings that country above the line for that return. Ireland, it's all policy. Really good government policy has driven that at a relatively lower expenditure point in terms of R&D relative to its GDP. I think it sort of truth proofs reasonably pretty well. We can see some work here to be done, perhaps around in Italy. And you can see Australia is sort of reasonably close to that line for the amount of expenditure it makes. But firstly, that's the relative expenditure in R&D in Australia in about 2014-15. That's the next year, 16-17, and that's 18-19. And so what you can see relative to GDP in Australia, that relative expenditure in R&D is going down. And in fact, that major cause of that is business expenditure in R&D in Australia. Business expenditure represents a very large component of overall expenditure of R&D relative to GDP, and this has really been driven through that. So perhaps the direction of travel is not where we might hope, and reasonably, it is an important piece, because when we try to interpret that graph, why does productivity travel with the investment in R&D? The work that's been done in other jurisdictions is quite significant. Now, that's because other jurisdictions faced an economic and social transition some time ago, particularly in the US, particularly in Europe, where what we saw was a change, of course, in traditional manufacturing, moving across to labor, moving offshore to compete on price. And then we saw, of course, as everyone knows in this room, the return of manufacturing in large part to centers in, again, the US and EU, predominantly competing now on the nature of the products of smart manufacturing. So that story's been well written, but across that period of time, Australia was really buffered, and buffered because it had a commodities generating good income rather than selling products, and it had good markets. Now, what we're seeing now is a transition for Australia, facing some cool geopolitical winds, and also coming to a much more clarity around an innovation-based economy than perhaps we've seen prior. Now, in saying that, one of the key pieces of work that has been well worked through OECD, EU, the US, is that why does R&D expenditure relative to GDP drive multi-factor productivity? And if I'm simplistic, and please forgive me, economists in the audience, really there are two main contributors. One happens to be essentially that word innovation, the new products, the new services, new processes that have been generated, informed by, not solely by R&D, but in large part informed by R&D. And that innovation coming out of the R&D has been estimated to contribute to about half of the OECD's GDP growth over the long term. So it's there driving productivity, reasonably in the long term and reasonably affecting material living standards. And so this piece is interestingly done by the chief economist in the office of the chief economist in Australia, and as far back as 2017. So a realization that R&D and innovation are inextricably linked and both contribute to good economic growth and productivity. And there are also very strong then subsequent pieces of work, which everyone will know, which innovation-based firms and companies consistently outperform firms who don't innovate. Now, the other key driver for that relationship between investment in R&D and productivity output was also, of course, the diffusion of the new technologies. In the economic transition, social transitions that occurred, the emergence of what were very clearly and mainly digital, but not solely, new technologies that began that whole wave of smart products. Now, the new technology, the work on this has again had time to be summarized by good working papers. And this is simply on just one piece from the OECD, that reasonably, if you have a very slow pace of diffusion of key technologies between countries or between firms, you see a slowing effect on economic growth in a region, or indeed at a country level if it's profound. And that productivity growth in firms at the frontier of technological change remains robust. And the productivity gap between those firms who've taken up new technologies and those who haven't is significant. And when that happens, the firm below that technology frontier, the ones who are not leaning in, only receive the benefits of those new technologies when they've been taken up by national firms, tested to the country's needs and adapted to country-specific circumstances. That gap in time can be sufficient to take that business out of business, because new companies come in and sort of eat their lunch. So the vast majority of Australian businesses are small business, often who wait and wait too long for the technologies to be taken up. And the diffusion of information and the demystification of those technologies, there's no significant places where you can travel, if you're a small company, to see the person up in Queensland or to see the person up in Northern Territory who's got a handle on this technology. You rely a lot on sharing the information about those emerging technologies within city-states or within the larger states themselves. So essentially, technology is both a boon for those firms on the frontier and a challenge for those smaller companies who are not convinced often by the innovation in that technology or that it is relevant for their business. So in putting that together in South Australia, what we've been looking at is to what extent we can look at a joined up ecosystem. So a research and innovation value chain. That is a value chain that drives supply chains for good health or environmental sustainability. Because sometimes describing a system to people that is joined up, when it is joined up, helps people understand that doing a program of work which is disconnected from that system may not be based on all of the information available to them to pick the actual issue where there is a gap that they can put a strategy in place to close and therefore get maximum efficiency, if you will, from a strategy. So essentially, the research and innovation value chain is no surprise to anyone here. So we've got excellence. You just can't deliver something new to the world if you've got me too kind of work. You need something that's got within it something that takes the eye, takes the interest, might be a new process, might be a new service, but there's plenty of literature that really does go into the impact of excellence to drive high growth firms with high patent libraries and significant R&D talent. But you need that excellence to work. You need collaboration, and we know that. You're not going to pull any innovation through unless there's a collaboration, maybe government, industry itself, but it's got to drive innovation and translation. And so, reasonably, in this value chain, if your excellence is here sitting happily without any collaboration, that's where it will stay. If you can pull it through, you've got innovation. If you've got a fighting chance to translate that, and that's a whole system, of course, in its own right, then that will begin to keep the value chain moving, maybe in an industry sector, maybe in agriculture, winemaking, can be in manufacturing, but you've got to take stock of those assets. And the piece that you will we'll all fall off unless we have is that next generation enabled future workforce. So the E here was a bit of a fudge, I have to admit it, because without that E, we would have been exiting the state of science. So I put the E in it, so we're exciting. So we've got that enabled future workforce. And I quite like the enabled because enabled allows that future workforce to have qualities which are really key for the future. So this is the Excite strategy, which we have developed. These are the headlines, obviously. Underpinning those headlines then are deeper pieces of work within which the innovation districts play a key role. The measures of each of these, there is plenty of empirical work that we can rely on for good measures. There's plenty of good KPIs which are bound across the OECD, EU, Japan, Korea, whole pieces of work in different parts of the US and North America. So we rely on that history of work to begin to understand how to measure performance as the ecosystem, and then why it's not working when the measures tell us there's a challenge. First thing is South Australia. What's our work like? So I'm a chief scientist, so I look at science. I like evidence, I like numbers. Fortunately, it's a creed, you know, if you're a scientist, you're compelled to find the numbers and you have to have it independently sourced. Goodness me. Anyway, what we found, we've done the work for South Australia as a state in the big fields, the top line fields in science, so the headline fields. And we've looked at them as if we were a country in the OECD. Now, that just means that we've taken the quality of published research, which is the normalized citation impact, so independent of field, it's related to the practice of citation in a field. And we've taken the whole of the OECD and we've taken countries in it. And if we were a country, we've inserted ourselves in the line in which our value places us in the hierarchy. What this tells you is, if we look at citation impact, this is Australia here, and this is South Australia in the bright yellow in the first left-hand column. And we are frequently in Australia in the top quartile and certainly in the top half. And one asterisk means we're in the top 3 in Australia, top 3 performers in the OECD. Australia's strong in the main fields. South Australia is also pretty strong, and 2 asterisks means that we are above the top performer in the OECD. Now, the OECD is a mixed group, but it's a more research-intensive group than the world at large, which is why I use the OECD. But just note, so we're in a good position for excellence in Australia. We know this, we keep doing it, and we keep finding the same answer. Australia, and indeed South Australia, are strong. This is industry research collaboration. Not so strong. We keep doing it, we keep finding it, and every time we find it, we say we must get on to that. You can see the exceptions are earth sciences, mining and resources and critical minerals in South Australia, and environmental sciences were in the top half. But the remainder, compared to the rest of the OECD, and reasonably Australia at large, is not much different. So it tells us we've got terrific assets, but we haven't got the collaboration. The other major elements that are coming to make life more complex than being within safe fields where we know the dynasties of leadership, we understand the legacy issues, and we stay firmly in our zone, is the convergence issues. This is work that's emerged out of massive work, particularly in health, but has spilled over to DARPA and defense and a whole array of other fields, where those new technologies that were coming out and building the multi-factor productivity, courtesy of R&D, were also having major impacts well beyond their own field of origin. So when you're taking a health aspect, there was a big meeting in MIT held by the NIH back in 2016 that said we are not leveraging the researchers coming out of engineering. We're not leveraging it in health. We're not leveraging artificial intelligence as it made itself known. We are not leveraging the new technologies to get to diagnostic imaging more quickly. And we need to converge. And convergent didn't just mean people talking to each other and having a cup of tea and agreeing they were all good and not getting on and doing too much together. It's actually complete convergence of ideas and methods across the boundaries. It goes beyond collaboration to bring out new disciplines completely, and it forms comprehensive frameworks that merge areas of knowledge. And it's a big challenge to academia because we're not recognized like that. Our buildings are often called very distinct names. We often see rival disciplines in rival faculties. So the way of moving to be able to assimilate the value of new technologies in particular into fields has never been writ larger. Now, initially in health, for instance, this is Texas A&M, invested about $500 million in an engineering medicine whole area, whole building, to really bring that engineering, that software engineering, that ability to look at people who may have lost ability before birth, after birth, or as they age, and some of the technical solutions and some of the engineering solutions. But essentially, the first cab off the rank to converge was engineering. Biomedical engineering became a thing and generated enormous opportunities. But World Economic Forum every year panel beat the new emerging technologies across the world with a panel and come up with the world's top 10. The ones that make the criteria that they're going to, I think it's realized 750 billion in capital, that's going to happen in the next 3 years, and that they're ready in 3 years for market. Now, this is the World Economic Forum predictions in 2018. And when you look at these, you kind of go, well, yeah, of course, that's happened. That wasn't happening when they predicted it. 3 years later, their prediction, by and large, is correct. So what you've got is augmented reality coming in to help surgeons in doing operations. Some of that is absolutely coming through. We're seeing personalized medicine. We're seeing artificial intelligence-led molecular design. That is using AI and data to help you visualize molecular structures rather than ever using a pipette in the laboratory. So that's pretty impressive. But this is actually happening. And the one, if you come down these, lab-grown meat, that was knowing that the protein appetite is high across the world, but not necessarily for emitting meat, and not necessarily from animals, and therefore the plant-based protein movement was afoot. And in 2018, that was generally thought to be an error. Nobody had picked it. You come down gene drive, and then here, algorithms for quantum computers. So an algorithm, not a quantum computer itself, but generating a quantum algorithm. In 2018, this sounded some way off. We're now living with it, and that is the natural piece. This is just showing artificial intelligence, all the disciplines that make up the research that went in across the world for 2 decades, that ultimately from which artificial intelligence and machine learning was born. The big pink bit back in 1998, computational linguistics. You'd have people to dinner, they're working on computational linguistics. You're probably thinking, that's great. That's really good. Glad I did it. Yeah, it's lovely work. What are they doing it for? You'd be asking. Turns out they knew things we didn't, at least I didn't. And here you see then movement as you got the computational linguistics, you begin to natural language processing came on board. You then get what was then called artificial intelligence. Notice the deep purples got thinner. That's because there's more specializations of artificial intelligence. It isn't all grouped together anymore. And we would then find that a decade later, starting from 1998, the first smartphone, 2008. Then we got facial recognition. Then we got a whole visual processing and video processing. And in 2018, we're now seeing facial recognition as part of security. So what we see here is the lessons learned in thinking about whether the predictions can come to pass, seeing those businesses who have allowed themselves to become closer to a potential future, and why innovation and new technologies drive that productivity through the work of companies that are high growth, understand the world of new technology, and have seen it out of the corner of their eye and begin to lean into the innovation. And that's where innovation districts begin to come in. Now, for those of you who may think that AI is either old hat or no one's going to use it, and people often fall into one of those two camps, you can now train in artificial intelligence in healthcare. Health has got a tremendous amount of data that needs intelligence brought to it and from it. And this is a piece of work which is quite remarkable. This is DeepMind through a computer has generated the known fold structures. This is a little bit of a stretch, but it's actually true, of at least 98% of all proteins we have as humans. The information in that is incredibly powerful, because not because we now know that, because we know it through data. And when you have data, you can visualize it. When you visualize it, you can play with things that bind to spiky viruses, for instance. You can begin to move in a way faster than in a laboratory. So this is just the next curve coming over. And that's what AI-led molecular design said in 2018. And this is in 2021 this year, 3 years on from the prediction. We would all have said, yeah, don't think so. So this tells us, it's the same slide, that being alert and aware to the emerging technology trends, the convergence with disciplines, means a different physical, structural, and cultural way of engaging between industry and research, and within research itself. And finally, just this week or last week, the Australian government produced a document on critical technologies, the importance of these technologies for the future of Australia, and quantum is one of those 9. And again, quantum is one of those slightly spooky ones. I always go on a lot about quantum. Somebody asked me, did I really love quantum technology? And I said, I always love what I don't understand. I'm a scientist, and understanding quantum is, it's a remarkable technology, but particularly for being able to transmit quickly encrypted data and also to deliver faster solutions, particularly in those massive data sets generated through AI. So where in Australia will our businesses come up against the frontier technologies? Where will they get a chance to have a play, have a use of them? Where will they see the business leaders talking about them in the reality of using them? Where will they meet the next new graduate for whom this has been part of their past, not is part of their future? How are we going to ensure that we are future-proofed and give resilience to our industry sectors? And reasonably, that's where this drive, this value chain, taking that collaboration and convergence into the innovation and the enabled future workforce. So reasonably, that it becomes a significant challenge in the average institutional laid out in that, either the 1970s or the 1870s. To be honest, it doesn't much matter. They've all got the same labels on the buildings and on the doors. And so the ability to provide spaces for convergence and collaboration, which then translates back into our research institutions and drives a cycle. So reasonably, in terms of our industry research collaborations, one of the pieces is to take the challenge. One of the challenges, South Australia here, so this is our business expenditure and R&D relative to gross state product. We're currently 3rd in the country on the last known measure. It's about the same on the most recent one, about 0.74, as it were, proportion of the GSP. But what you can see is, as I said earlier, for Australia at large, and every one of these is actually trending downwards, and in South Australia, we're no different. It's trending downwards. So we have to address that piece. Without it, we are absolutely not going to change anything about the economy of Australia to be that innovation-based economy. So, and that's because we will lose the accelerant that others have found exists when you somehow put the system together, the ecosystem together to achieve it. Now, this is out of Amsterdam. I think it's out of Amsterdam. It's a knowledge quarters, and the knowledge quarter rather, and it's a visualization of how in that innovation neighborhood, disciplines by color of the line, so the health is green, economics is pink, and environmental science is purple, and the AI computers are oranges. And so what they're doing is visualizing the convergence, visualizing the engagement, the collaborations between researchers or industry and researchers in this knowledge quarter innovation neighborhood. So you can, if you can just see from a distance, some of that orange is coming down and it's coming into health. The economics is doing a circuitry route here and coming right in. So the pull force of these disciplines is bringing in the convergence, and then you go deeper and you see who and where and what are being part of that. So being able to take a physical landscape and interrogate the research and innovation value chain in it to understand what is the issue and what isn't. We all of us, when we're asked to diagnose, tend to go for the problem that was most recently we experienced. But reasonably having some strong data as to whether everyone experiences that and how did they solve it in other jurisdictions is an asset. Collaboration driving innovation. This is looking just at volume of outputs here and just looking at volume of outputs in different disciplines again, different colors equal the different disciplinary outputs. So you've got thousands of research publications coming out. This is the patent citations associated with them. So what of this, if any, is being translated? What is being translated? Why is some and not others? How can we understand how the innovation is going to be pulled through in translation? What you can see are some big guns up at the top: cancer and multidisciplinary sciences and neurology, far more patent citations than you would expect for volume. And here's, even when volume is here, biomed engineering, which makes sense, internal medicine and biochemistry. So you begin to get a sense of who's doing what, who you need to help, who's doing a great job and could be part of actually supporting those who are finding it tough. So when we get into thinking about that whole ecosystem, you've got to come with a sort of bag of tools. You've got to be able to feel comfortable that you can look at the value chain, that you can understand what it is you should do as strategy number 32, rather than repeat strategy number 31. We've got a world of knowledge, which this very prescient meeting is dealing with across lots of different examples. I quite like the Manchester example because it's a complete economic and social transformation through innovation, corridors and neighbourhoods that brought in, firstly, the Oxford Road Corridor, the world-class hub for health innovation, brought together all of the key partners, then attracted the science and technology and the companies and the biotech, because that was where you had to be for the knowledge. So that's really clearly an important piece. Out of all of this work to date has come those headings, which we all understand: leading edge anchor institution, the culture, the collaboration big, amenity and infrastructure. You've got the pieces that are going to allow you to have a good cup of coffee, as well as see that frontier technology in action without maybe trying before you buy, and a competitive advantage compared to your other competitors, and market access for your products. So we understand that piece. But what I think we've not been quite so good at in Australia because we're new in a sense, we're moving forwards with it, is to really activate the districts. What's required to activate? This was something, the Decline, Fight Back and Victory piece came out of KPMG doing an analysis of cities that had had a decline, fought back and came out good as distinct from not surviving. And I had the pleasure to meet Caroline Haynes as the economist who put this work together with her colleagues and brought her over to Newcastle so she could help us understand. She's an economist. They'd looked at 160 cities. They'd looked at the trajectory over time and what had happened, the lived experience. And so activation requires activating a lived experience that has some deep prior history that gives you confidence that you're not wasting people's time. So essentially, they looked at measures of annual jobs growth, gross state product or metro product, regional product. And they also looked at the proportion of young wealth creators. Now, they just gave that title as a sort of not because they're all wealth creators, but they were very tightly associated, that proportion, with the number of patents per 10,000 people in the region. And they found that if you had a relentless focus on attracting the young wealth creators, that was a direct relationship to the city's economic growth, and that those young wealth creators came because of something which attracted them in. They had the physical cityscape, they had the peer groups, they had the restaurants, and they needed all of those elements. It's not a livable city, it's a city that's on the rise. It's at an inflection point going up. It's really on the move. And that pulled them in because if you're in the creative industries, you use augmented reality. If you're in molecular design, you use it. You can have conversations in the bar and you're talking like with like. You've got a community you want to be part of. Throwing up a startup space in a little bit of a sort of isolated corridor in a sort of way outside the city, huge amounts of work done across the world to show that's not going to work. That was the of the innovation district. And so reasonably, we know the magnets for talent. We know a lot from the Brookings Institution work, the knowledge and economic assets, physical assets, and networking assets. So currently in South Australia, we've got a lot of those assets, but we haven't activated all the component parts. So in the Excite strategy, this is just a summary. The short headings there are whole programs of work that we're putting in place. And just today, I put in red the ones which are really key. The innovation and translation intermediaries. You bring in well-credentialed groups to set up within an innovation district to be the concierge, the curator, the hosting of seminars of business leaders who tell the lived experience. You really work that space systematically. You don't just hope for a few drinks evenings and it's all going to permeate through. Frontier technology capability centers, people have got to try before they buy. They've got to be convinced. They've got to work with people or invest, co-invest with others to see what a new AI system, what quantum algorithms actually mean for logistics, in why is your competing companies using those logistics to do better business and so forth. Industry doctoral training centers, locating the PhD components in a university is key, but bringing them into an innovation district where business leaders are leading the plus side, helping you understand the industry you may go into, what limits that industry, what foresight the industry needs, mRNA vaccines, biomanufacturing, just to talk about something that's literally present. Biomanufacturing Industry Doctoral Training Center, bringing students with different disciplines and different technologies together, but not disrupting the PhD work, running a plus session, a plus meaning access to business, access to their problems, access to the directions, taking account of co-working spaces that have to be set up, the translation intermediaries, knowledge transfer networks, running innovation challenges, which we've just done this year, and getting inpatient capital interested, not the patient capital, the inpatient capital. and a place where you begin the STEM skills, where people come and see the actuality of what is driving. So what we're using is the intermediaries. We will have one established in the Health Innovation and District and Translation District. Hopefully, we're just going through all the processes to significantly lift the systematic harnessing of the people resources, the actual technology resources, the infrastructure resources, all of which are there but need that activation. Helping businesses, particularly SMEs, learn their way through frontier technologies that they've seen out of the corner of their eye, but are a bit not sure whether they should be able to invest in it. Run industry doctoral training centres in areas of key interest, and the state's co-investing in these, and to get that convergence naturally without artifice. We're lucky, I think, the national government, I think through the challenge of sovereign capability, disrupted global supply chains, seeing what's needed in a vaccine or PPE or other major supply chains, have begun to invest significantly in areas to really, and often quite across party lines, as it were, across party discipline lines, rather than trying to maintain the prior structures to work on convergence. We're the industry doctoral training centres. I'm a great believer in, if somebody's done something well, you can learn your lessons from that, and you don't have to relearn them by doing something badly, because you haven't looked at what other people have done, and you can harness all of that prior work. So industry doctoral training centres, the UK, through the Engineering Physics Science Research Council, and subsequently picked up others, got some fabulous models. And reasonably, they've been doing it for a significant period of time. So this is just one piece of work that started back in 2008, the Biopharmaceutical Bioprocessing Tech Centre, bringing together initially separate areas. Over 10 years have worked with companies and almost 50 research projects and supervisors, and have had significant success and particularly for the students who have had a much higher retention rate in their PhD than those who are not in such centres. The model just goes, as I've said, you bring together your industry doctoral training program, your PhD is managed as it's always best managed, but you have an industry supervisor along with your academic supervisor. Most people can do that, but the program of added value is in here, and it's in the innovation district. That's where you get that. Just down the corridor, you can see the digital twin system at work, or Line Zero, or the robotics, and you get a sense of that. In terms of the frontier technologies, Lot 14 will not activate what is happening in other districts unless we ensure it does, and vice versa. So we have to walk in the doors and find out, where is AI going? Why are people talking more about quantum? Is it going to change the way industry in my world actually is their business model? And so this is growing apace. This is a magnet for those young wealth creators, because it's a place of new knowledge, innovation, discovery, and that's a really interesting piece that we're seeing in real time being activated. I love the space piece, and clearly Tonsley is emerging. Those of you who were at the Science Excellence and Innovation Awards on Friday, you have a sense sitting in it, but what it does, its origins, its roots, its DNA, it's as much captures that DNA of those lovely buildings in Manchester or around the ports in Liverpool. We have our own activation of our own prior industry, the prior Mitsubishi manufacturing facility. So what a wonderful next generation to make it. Delivering the innovations, one thing, translating it is another. These are just, this is Alex Grant. I know many of you at UniSA would have known Alex well. our superb mathematician, our discovery grants to Bern, just phenomenal mathematician, but who saw something new, went for it, and is now, running a company with incredible innovation that's being translated. So setting this system up within the district so it's relatively easy is key. And just to finally say, all of this is set up in the context of a research and innovation ecosystem. Stabbing at pieces at it without knowing what came before in an industry or what's coming next is reasonably a recipe for either hitting lucky first time or spending a lot of time not finding that you're traveling in the right direction because there were some pieces of that ecosystem you hadn't recognized or were aware weren't missing, or there were pieces that were already well in play, and that there's the next stage of foresight is to, in a sense, leapfrog over the current state. So as a chief scientist, research and innovation value chain, driving supply chains and outcomes, how we make those wonderful locations fully activate is about everyone in this room. It's about people. It's about having value for every quiet thinker, noisy thinker, new thinker. And it's reasonably about pulling together the technology that you've never can understand. I mean, some of this is just remarkable, but you don't have to because you're working with the key people who do. We've got the excellence, we've got the collaboration, innovation, we've got the translation. That's what our innovation districts will be generating. So thank you.